Hello, I'm Dr. Chandler. Welcome to my video notes on biological psychology. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the triune brain. Here is a diagram that I have drawn of a silhouette or the side view of a human head. The area inside that I've made green is known as the brainstem. The highest portion of the brainstem is about the size of your fist and is located at the center of your brain, about where your ear is located on the outside of your head. The area that wraps around the brainstem that I've colored red is called the limbic system. Limbic means border and is the area between the brainstem and the neocortex. Neo means new. This is the area that I have outlined with blue that wraps around the limbic system. It's kind of like a quilt, a thin top layer covering the limbic system, which covers the brainstem. These are areas of the brain more than they are specific structures. Together, these areas are called the triune brain. Tri means and un means for 3 in 1. Let's focus on the brainstem. The brainstem is sometimes called the dinosaur brain. It's called that for several reasons. It is thought to be the oldest part of the human brain, the part that we share with all creatures, and this is the part of the brain that is like a giant lizard, all about survival systems, heart rate, respiration, swallowing, digestion. If there is an injury in this area of the brain, one is likely to die without immediate intensive medical intervention, such as a machine breathing or taking in nutrients for the individual. I've made an area within the brainstem multicolored. This area is known by several names: the reticular activating system, or RAS, and the reticular formation. You have heard the word retina, a lens in your eye that takes in light. This information is communicated to the reticular formation, RET, or RET, means a net of neural fibers. The RAS is known for neural arousal. You can understand how the amount of light you perceive affects your waking and sleeping cycles. We'll discuss these cycles in terms of your circadian rhythms when we review altered states of consciousness. At the top of the brainstem is an area called the thalamus. Some say the thalamus is in the limbic area. Others say the thalamus is in the brainstem. The thalamus bridges these two areas. The thalamus is thought to be the relay station of nerve impulses, which I think necessary for survival, so I've placed it in the brainstem. The thalamus is where almost all incoming stimuli goes first, and it's then sorted out. Oh, your visual information, so you go to the occipital lobe. Or, your tactile stimuli, you go to the sensory cortex. Some information bypasses the thalamus and goes directly into the sensory motor cortex. For example, if you put your hand on a hot stove, this survival information will bypass the thalamus. Still, our neurons do not communicate as fast as the speed of light or heat, so you'll be burned before you get the information, ouch, and yank your hand off of the hot stove. Just below the thalamus is an area known as the hypothalamus. Hypo means below, like a hypodermic needle delivers medicine below the skin. The hypothalamus is also known as the pleasure center and is involved with all addictive drugs and addictive behaviors. Sometimes the brainstem in general is called the seat of the 4 F's. F for fighting, F for fleeing, F for feeding, and F for fornication. The hypothalamus in particular could be called the seat of the 4 F's. In the 70s, I took a graduate neuropsychology course with a lab component. In the lab, we implanted electrodes into the hypothalamus of a rat. You might think this was a cruel thing to do, but remember that the hypothalamus is the pleasure center of the brain. That rat would do backflips to get a zap to his hypothalamus. Getting back to the diagram of the triune brain, wrapped around the brainstem is the area known as the limbic system, and this area is called the seat of the emotions. Earlier I stated that most internal and external stimuli goes to the thalamus or relay station of the brain first. Our sense of smell is different. Smell stimuli enters our brain through our nose and goes straight to the olfactory bulb tucked into the limbic system. This is why we have strong emotions associated with smells. Because our hippocampus is in the limbic system area also, this is why memories are strongly associated with scents, spelled S-C-E-N-T-S, for fragrance. Again, you see the brainstem, the limbic system wrapped around the brainstem, and a structure that you are already familiar with inside the limbic system, the hippocampus. Remember the hippocampus as the big place of learning. The hippocampus stores and reconstructs memories. On the ends of each side of the hippocampus are the amygdalae, plural, or the amygdala, singular. The amygdala is the part of your brain that processes fear, anger, rage, and aggression. Very important for survival. Here are a few professional artists' rendering of these areas and structures in the brain. I like this first diagram because it shows the dimensionality of the brain, difficult to get in a picture that's 2 dimensions. This shows how the limbic area is around the brainstem area. You've seen the diagram with the dark blue background before. The area shaded in blue is the corpus callosum, the hard band of nerve fibers that is packed with neurons that makes communication between the 2 hemispheres of the brain possible. You also see the top of the brainstem, the hypothalamus tucked inside the hippocampus and colored a softer shade of blue. You are now seeing the newest area of the brain, again like a quilt wrapped around the limbic system. This part of your brain is known as the cerebrum, or the cortex, or I've called it the neocortex. The neocortex is the thinking area of the brain and informs your emotions, hopefully before you act. Here is my drawing of the lobes of the neocortex. Remember, this is a thin covering around the limbic system that has specialized areas of functioning. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Remember, FPOT, FPOT. The frontal lobe does the higher thinking and reasoning and motor behavior. Think before you act. The parietal lobe is responsible for sensory experience and also association, which means a mixed bag of neural tasks or memories. The occipital lobe is your visual cortex. The temporal lobe was once thought to be about wisdom because our hair turns gray on our temples first. Hence the name was given temporal, meaning wisdom. However, now we know that this area of the brain, right below our ears, is specialized as the auditory lobe. Here is an artist's rendering of the lobes of the brain with the cerebellum and brainstem. Here you can see how the movement or motor area is at the back of the frontal lobe, and the touch or sensory area is at the front of the parietal lobe. Let's look at these areas more closely. Here are some diagrams of the sensory motor cortex. If I had named this part of the brain, I would have called it the motor sensory cortex, because you can see how the motor cortex is in front of the sensory cortex. Some call this part of the brain the little person in our heads, because this part of the brain is mapped out, and if a particular area of the sensory lobe is stimulated, we can accurately predict where the individual says they have experienced the sensation. We can also accurately predict which part of the body will move depending on the area of the motor cortex that is stimulated. Of course, this person does not look like us. The area in the brain is larger for body areas that have more control or sensation in the sensory lobe and the motor lobe, such as the tongue. So this is why humans do not kiss with elbows, because there's very little sensation or control in the elbows. You can see how the little man in your head looks very different than you do. Here's a review of some of this lecture's content: the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and here's some information on the cerebellum, which is responsible for balance, coordination, and skilled motor activity. Also, individuals with hyperactivity disorders and attention disorders will sometimes have an underdeveloped cerebellum. You also see in this diagram the brainstem responsible for survival systems. Here's my drawing of the brain, and you should practice creating this diagram and labeling the parts. You'll be responsible for the structures and the functions of the brainstem, the limbic system, and the neocortex. You'll also be asked to diagram and label the parts of the triune brain and the cerebellum, including labeling the functions of these parts or areas of the brain for an in-class quiz, and you will not be allowed to have diagrams in your notes for this quiz.